Hey guys, good morning. My name is Marcus Bressler. I'm a police officer here in Huntsville and worked as a probation officer for years up in the state of Alaska as a probation and parole officer. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about probation and parole and the theory behind it. The big question, as it always is, if it really works and if it's a waste of time, a waste of funds, and a little bit about the background and the case law for a probation officer. Before we start, I just want to tell you that probation is part of our criminal justice system, but it belongs to corrections. So we could say that a probation officer comes into play when a person is sentenced by a court in the United States. However, there's one difference here, and that is that we are involved in a so-called pre-sentence status. When a person is found guilty, most courts order a pre-sentence report from a probation officer. So technically, a probation officer is already involved before a person is actually sentenced. Okay, what we're going to talk about in the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about the definition of parole and probation, as I already mentioned it a little bit and explained it to you. We'll take a look at a case, sentencing and supervision of John Doe. We just name him John Doe for our class purpose. Then we'll talk about the role of probation and parole officer. And then number 4, you see, we'll talk about the limited due process rights on supervision. And supervision includes probation and or parole. And we'll talk about the fact that a person can be on probation, a person can be on parole, or a person can be on probation and parole. And then it gets a little difficult. We will talk about a practical case from your textbook, which I found pretty interesting. And maybe we want to take a look what an alternative would be to approach the case of this failing probationer, Allen. And lastly, I want to talk about rehabilitation versus change. That's not really in your textbook. It's just something to think about when we define rehabilitation and when we define change. Okay, we'll talk about probation. And probation is a pre-sentence status and an investigation period. An officer of the court is then ordered to supervise a sentenced person for a time period determined by the court, and that's a suspended sentence. We'll talk about it in a minute. A parole officer is an officer of the Department of Corrections of a state, and this officer is supervising sentenced inmates in the community. So a probation and parole officer has actually 2 jobs in one. First, he's an officer of the court who can be tasked to produce a pre-sentence report before a judge is actually sentencing a person he or she found guilty. Secondly, a probation officer can also be a parole officer. In that situation, he is actually an officer of the Department of Corrections and is tasked to supervise inmates who are released to the community to serve their time in the community. In both cases, most states who have combined probation and parole allow their probation officers to be law enforcement officers, sworn law enforcement officers. All right, here is our example. Let's say our inmate, his name's John Doe, and he's facing 7 years for robbery in the first degree, and he committed that on January 20th of this year. He has been in jail on a pre-sentence status since that day. He was arrested on January 20th. The district court found Mr. Doe guilty on June 24th, so that's today, or tomorrow, I think it is today, on robbery in the first degree. So John Doe has been in jail for about 6 months now. The district court said we will sentence him on July 20th. So it's about a month out. In that time period, the judge will not look at the facts again and say, well, is this person guilty or not? He already found him guilty. He will now determine what a proper sentence is, the length of the sentence. So he contacts the probation department and says, hey, I need a pre-sentence report. I need to know everything about this person. So one of the probation officers, not a parole officer, you have to understand the difference here. A parole officer works for the Department of Correction, is only involved after a person is sentenced. So a probation officer, as a pre-sentence investigator, will be tasked to submit a pre-sentence report. And this pre-sentence report includes all the facts of the crime again, The probation officer will talk to victims, will talk to witnesses, will talk to the police department. The probation officer also will go and conduct a criminal background check. That means he will take a look at older files, see what the person did before. He will talk to the family, will see if the person is employed or not, and so on and so forth. In summary, the pre-sentence investigator, or the probation officer, will try to give all the details about this person to the judge. The reason why this is done is because, of course, the prosecuting attorney has an agenda. He wants the highest sentence possible. And the attorney has an agenda. He probably is focusing on getting his client out of jail. So the probation officer is the only person here who gets all the information together and gives it to the judge, and he's unbiased. So there's a condition of sentencing. It looks like in our case, John Doe had an attorney and the prosecutor. They agreed on a sentencing structure and said, look, we agree that he's guilty if we can come up with this proposal. It's important to see that neither the judge nor the probation officer have to agree with a sentencing agreement. That's the so-called Rule 11 agreement. The judge most likely will accept it. The probation officer sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. But under normal circumstances, all the parties agree on something. It's a Rule 11 agreement. And in this case, the condition of sentencing is incarceration, 10 years with 4 years suspended. That means 10 years is a sentence, 4 years suspended means he will do 6 years. Time served for previous incarceration, on that case only, goes from January 20th to sentencing date, July 20th. So 6 months. That means, of the condition of sentencing, we have 6 years minus 6 months. That's 5 years and 6 months. Now, states sometimes deal and handle parole differently. A big majority, and I assume Alabama is the same, like it was in Alaska, like in other states I've seen so far. After a third of the incarcerated time, a person can be placed on parole. That is a can, it's not a must. So the judge says, or in the Rule 11 agreement, they all agree and say, yep, we'll do 10 years for suspended, time served for previous incarceration, gives us 5 years and 6 months. After that time, or within that time frame, 1/3 of the time has to be served, and then the parole board, which is part of the Department of Corrections, and a parole officer, excuse me, can determine whether or not they allow our John Doe to serve the rest of his time on the street in the community. The judge also rules, or they bring it to the judge's attention, say, we agreed that we have probation for 5 years for the 4 years suspended. That means the person will be, after incarceration, returned to the community for 5 years and will be supervised for these 5 years by a probation officer. If a violation occurs, the 4 years suspended, they come from the 10 years minus 4 years, the 6 years to serve leaves 4 years open. They can be placed back, and the person can or could go back to jail for 4 years. They also agreed on condition of probation. That's my experience, most of the biggest case, where of course the probation officer wants really strict, very detailed, a lot of probation conditions to effectively supervise, while of course the defense attorney doesn't want that. So sometimes when it comes to sentencing, the probation officer, the district attorney, and the defense attorney argue a little bit back and forth. In our case, you can take a look at textbook, page 395. You have a figure 12.3. It shows you standard condition of probation. That's pretty much what this looks like. Every state is a little different, but they all have the same purpose. In our case, since he committed a robbery 1 violation of the law, the probation officer asked for special conditions, which are anger treatment and victimization awareness treatment. So he puts this in his report to the judge and says, hey, look, based on what I see here, I want anger treatment for this person. So within the time frame on probation, the person has to successfully pass anger treatment. If he doesn't, if he fails to do so, that will be a condition violation, probation violation, and a report could be submitted to the court, and the probation officer could recommend to determine him from probation. Okay, with that being said, let's move on. Incarceration started on January 20th of 2014. Sentence on July 20th of 2014 gives us 6 months. As I explained earlier, that's previous time or time served. We have 10 years with 4 years suspended, 6 years to serve. The 6 months, as I explained earlier, are deducted, so 5 years and 6 months to serve. Parole can start after 1/3 of the sentencing, 2 years to serve. We have 6 years, and he has 2 years to serve. The release date to parole, then, if he gets sentenced on July 20th, would be July 20th of 2016. So he serves 2 years, then he can go to the parole board and say, hey, look, I've been a good inmate, I did whatever you want me to do, I did treatment, I have a job, I didn't get involved in any fights, I would like to go out on parole, here's my parole plan. So he comes up with a plan to provide for his family, if he has any, to get a job, and to go back into community. The parole time, as we said earlier, is the rest of the time he has in the community. So, the parole time ends on July 20th of 2020, 4 years. Remember, we have 6 years to serve. He did 2 years, so 4 years are still there. He needs to serve the 4 years. The parole board decides what the judge wants or not. It's not part of sentencing. The parole board decides to send your guy, Mr. Doe, to the street and let him do his time on the street. And that means he has 4 years left to serve on parole. So if he goes out on parole, a parole officer, which is also a probation officer, will be appointed by the Department of Corrections, the parole board, to supervise Mr. Doe for 4 years. The parole board will implement conditions similar to the probation conditions. Sometimes they're pretty much the same, sometimes they vary a little bit, but it's the same principle. The parolee, it's pretty much a contract between the parolee and the Department of Corrections. He can accept them or don't. If he doesn't accept them, by all means, the Department of Corrections doesn't have to send him to parole. They can say, you know what, if you don't want to follow our conditions, you can stay in jail. So it's pretty much a contract where the parolee has to agree. Now, let's assume Mr. Doe gets 2 years in jail, he does 2 years, and he goes out on parole. On that day, on July 20th of 2016, his incarceration ends. His parole time starts, and at that moment, also his probation time starts, because he is out of jail, or out of prison in this particular case. So probation also starts on the same time as parole on July 20th of 2016. Now in this case, remember, the judge said during sentencing we have 5 years of probation. So on July 20th of 2021, as you can see in the slide in front of you, this is when the 5 years are over. So for right now, our parolee will be on parole for 4 years and probation for 5 years. That's just how this works. If Mr. Doe violates, let's say, parole time or parole conditions, he will be returned to jail and will be a violation report will be submitted to the parole board. If he violates probation, he will be returned to jail, and the judge, the sentencing judge, the sentencing court will be informed through a probation violation. Now here's a little problem. Let's say somebody violates parole and probation at the same time. Let's say in both conditions, the parole board said you cannot consume controlled substances, which is a pretty standard condition. The judge said the same in the probation condition, said you cannot consume controlled substances. Now let's say the probation officer does a home inspection around midnight on a Saturday evening, and John Doe sits at home and smokes pot. He will be arrested. The probation officer is a peace officer, is a law enforcement officer. He has arrest powers. He arrests Mr. Doe and takes him back to jail. Now, since Mr. Doe was on both parole and probation, the probation officer most likely will file a parole report first, and then a probation report. Why is that? It is simply because the sentencing judge gave Mr. Doe to the Department of Corrections. So technically the DOC, Department of Corrections, is still in charge of him. So the general idea is to let him do his time with DOC first and then bring him on probation. And here's the idea behind that. Let's say Mr. Doe goes back to jail on a parole violation. The parole board says, well, you really made a big mistake here. We'll leave you in jail for about 6 months. You do another, let's say, substance abuse treatment, and then you can go back out on parole. His probation time stops because he's back in jail and not on probation. When he then returns to parole and probation again, parole starts all over again, but he gets time served for the time in jail, while probation starts all over again minus the time he had been out before. So it's a little complicated, but I want you to see where this goes. It's not as easy as people sometimes think. Okay, let's assume he's out on parole and probation. He is supervised by the conditions of the DOC parole board and the conditions of the district court. Okay, we talked about parole after 1/3. We talked about probation, when probation starts, and how they can be combined. Now, it could easily be somebody gets sentenced and says, look, I don't want probation. I do my time. And the Rule 11 agreement, as I explained earlier, all parties in the criminal justice system say, you know what, okay, if you don't want probation, that's fine. Parole is still in the room, because after 1/3 you can go on parole. The judge cannot decide whether or not a person should be on parole. A judge can only send a person to the care of DOC, and they can do whatever the law allows. So if parole is an option, they can offer him parole. Sometimes, unfortunately, and we'll talk about it later at the end or maybe in the next session a little bit, when a person has been incarcerated quite some time as a criminal career, and they had failures before on probation and parole, they don't even want to do it any longer. They just want to do, as we call, flat timing. They say, hey, I flat time my time, I want to go to jail, I'll do whatever's necessary, but I don't want to be in parole, I don't want to be on probation, because I will get in trouble again, we'll catch new charges, and I never interrupt the cycle. Okay, so far so good. I'll make it a little more complicated. We have a so-called Good Time Award. Alaska had it, where I worked, Alabama had it as well, and that makes it completely confusing. This is called, a Good Time Award is nothing else than an early release from prison versus a mandatory release. Remember, we said John Doe had 10 years and he served 6 years. The Department of Corrections says, you know what, we'll give you 1/3, so for every 3 days you get 1 day off, and that's called good time. So behave for 3 days and you earn 1 day early release. This is done to increase good behavior, to motivate inmates to follow through with programming, substance abuse, victim awareness, whatever is available in jail. Maybe get their GEDs, some even go to college online. Pay fines or restitution while they work in prison. And stay out of trouble, of course. Don't fight, and all those wonderful things there are. Now, if a prisoner violates institutional rules, let's say he's fighting or he has contraband, this Good Time Award can be taken away by the superintendent. So let's say somebody gets sentenced for 3 years. 1 year is good time out of the bed. So he only serves 2 years. Now, while he's in jail, he does just fine, never gets in trouble, never violates the rules. He will be on parole or probation in 2 years instead of 3. Let's say he violates institutional rules, well then the superintendent can say, look, I'll add 6 months out of 1 year, or the entire good time will be suspended and you will do your 3 years. This is a little carrot they put in front of an inmate and say, hey, behave, do what we tell you to do, and we will benefit you somehow and you will get out a little earlier. So in our case with John Doe, he has 6 years to serve. 4 years are already suspended. From that time, he gets another 1/3 taken off. So he only actually serves 4 years. So from a 10-year sentence, 4 years already suspended, 6 years to serve, and now he gets another 1/3 taken off for good time. So he only serves 4 years. So the adjusted release date, that's how we call that. Adjusted release date includes the deduction of good time and the deduction of suspended time, which is probation. The adjusted release date to probation will be July 20th of 2016. There's a little mistake. It says 2116, so bear here with me. It means 2016. When you look at textbook page 394, figure 12.2 tells you or shows you how much time a person actually spends in jail. And we can, every once in a while, I'm surprised when people say, well, he got 50 years and 60 years to serve. Well, they don't include good time, they don't include probation and parole time, and they don't include their numerous options to receive an early release and to spend that time on probation and parole. Another early release is furlough. We'll talk about it later on in time, but furlough is not probation, is not parole. Furlough only means you're being, the inmate, in this case John Doe, he's doing well. Why should we not keep him? Why should we keep him in jail? Why should he not go to the community, get a job, get some job training, make money, and get the foot back into the door for the time after incarceration? And he goes to a so-called halfway house. Now, a probation officer and a parole officer can place, if the conditions allow that, they can place Mr. Doe in a halfway house while he is in probation and parole. Okay, I know that's a little confusing, but let's move on. We talked about a role of probation officer a little bit, 396 on your textbook, and I just want to summarize that. I believe probation and parole officer is the best job you can ever have in law enforcement, because you are an investigative officer for pre-sentence status, or when your parolee or your probationer makes a mistake, gets in trouble again, right? You get the new case and you have to follow through with that and present your findings and the evidence to the parole board or the probation department in the district court. You're a supervisor. You supervise, I don't know, in Alaska, you see it at the very bottom. We had about 36 probationer. EM is electronic monitoring, so house arrest or intensive supervision. And if there was just a regular parolee or a probationer, it was about 75 per probation officer. While in Alabama, one of the probation officers told me she's supervising 150 to 200. So you see the difference. If you only have 36 or even only 75, you can actually really care about your probationers. And it's not that we try to get them back to jail, we actually try to change or rehabilitate them. So less the casework, the better it is. Some states have a higher caseload, and as you can imagine, that means we have less time with our clients. We're treatment coordinators. We look and make sure our clients go to treatment. Most of them have, and you might have already covered that in your class, or will cover it, some history of mental health, substance abuse, anger. One or the other plays into it, sometimes even all together. We try to get them into employment, right? So we work really hard with employers and try to get our people back into the workforce. As I said earlier, we are the prosecuting rule. If we realize there is a violation of the condition of parole, probation, or a new law violation, let's say our probationer goes to Walmart and steals something, that's a new law violation. We have to bring that to the attention of the court or the parole board, or both. Page 405, I found this pretty interesting. I want to take a look at that. The victim rights on parole. Victims have rights, they have a say. When somebody wants to go on parole, even with probation, the judge listens to the victims a lot. I mean, parole, when I was working probation and parole, it was a big thing to actually talk to the victims. Sometimes victims say, hey, look, I don't want this guy back on the road. He did so many bad things in his life before, I think he should stay in jail. So that's a public safety issue. I just want to tell you that victims have a big say, and that's good. We have to ensure that we do not re-victimize our community or the victims who were already victims before. Now, lastly, I found this pretty interesting, is that we collect restitution, fines, and funds of our probationers. Let's say they work and they have to pay $5,000 restitution to the victim. It is our job to take, let's say, 10%, 20% out of it and return it to the victim. Okay, the basic philosophy of probation and parole. Parole revocation comes before probation revocation. I said this earlier a little bit. First, we want to get him through DOC. So if there's a violation, we take it to the parole board, inform the district court, and say, hey, look, hold on with probation right now. There's a pending case. It can also be there's a new case. Let's say a probationer committed a new crime. Then he will go to jail for the new crime, and parole and probation holds. We'll wait until this new crime has been addressed by the court, and then we afterwards address it with our probation conditions and parole conditions. So it can get a little complicated. We have, as we said down the bottom, and you can take a look at page 397, so-called technical violations and new law violations. Technical violation is simply when a person does not obey the conditions of the parole board or the district court. Mistreatment, missed appointments. For instance, he's not going to work. There's curfew. He or she is not following through. Those are technical violations. A probation officer tries for the first 2 or 3 times to work with his probationer or parolee and adjust the behavior. If that's not working, then eventually the person will be returned to jail. There are 2 cases I want to bring to your attention real quick. That's Morrissey versus Brewer and Gagnon versus Carpelli, both on page 399, and they're really interesting for us on working in probation and parole. It pretty much tells you that somebody on probation and parole has limited due process rights. Now, I don't want to go into any details what due process is, but there are reasons why that is the case. A probation and parolee has already been sentenced, so the conditions of parole or probation are not part of the new crime if he violates them. They're already sentenced for it. It's nothing else in a contract. That also means that the person on probation and parole, as long as he doesn't commit a new crime, you don't have to Mirandarize him. There's no need to read him the rights and say, hey, look, you just violated your probation or parole. That is because it's not a new crime. And that's pretty interesting. You see at the very bottom the little question I have there. Why will a probation and parole officer include local, state, and federal authorities if there is a new law violation? You could easily argue and say, hey, look, Mr. Doe in our case is already on your supervision. You are a probation and parole officer. You are a law enforcement officer. Why do you include local, state, or federal authorities? It's pretty simple. As a probation officer, we work for the court. When we already work for the court, we are biased. So we need to include a local, state, or federal authority, depending on the crime, to show that we are not biased in this case, and we'll let our probationer go, give him to the care of the local, state, and federal authorities, and ask them to do the investigation for us. That is pretty much why, even though we can arrest and prosecute and bring it to the attention of the prosecuting attorney, most POs won't do that. Okay. We talked about, in your book it tells a lot about, does probation parole work? There's one underlying statement I want to tell you. Probation parole works only if the probationer or parolee works to make it work. In other words, a probation officer or parole officer cannot make it happen that someone is successful on it. There is intensive supervision, which pretty much means that you have a probationer and you see him daily. There's a lot of UA testing. You have a very close relationship with your probationer. You have day reporting centers. It tells you that on page 409 to 411. You have problem courts of mental health, alcohol, and family violence in the meantime. Shock incarceration, home confinement, employment centers, treatment centers, halfway houses. As you see in the bottom, a PO has a lot of roles, wears a lot of hats depending on the situation he or she is in. But probation and parole only works when the person who is on probation and parole wants to be successful. That's the bottom line. Okay, let's take a look at our case here on page 398. That's Allen. When you read through this for a second, I summarized it here for us. Allen is on probation. He's violating his probation conditions by staying out late and having contact with the wrong crowd. So it looks like he goes back to where he came from and is hanging out in a criminal field. He is consuming controlled substances. He admitted to it, and his UA was positive. He tells his probation officer that he feels agitated and feels rage. The probation officer sent him to a mental health treatment center to get evaluated, and they said, look, he doesn't need it right now. So he was denied for mental health treatment. He violates his technical conditions, as you can see, by being out late and being in contact with, we can say, criminals. Now, he also commits a new crime by possessing controlled substances and consuming controlled substances while on probation. When he possesses it, that's a new crime, mostly against any state or local law. But it's also a violation of his probation. I don't see that Alan is on parole, so let's just say it's a condition violation in probation. So the question is this: you are the probation officer, you see that Alan is struggling. He's open and honest about it, which is a good thing. He tells you he feels rage. He admits that he's using controlled substances, and he's even telling you, look, I'm staying out late already. So you can see the writing on the wall. So what do? You can return him to prison for probation violation, but what about rehabilitation on the other side? You can leave him in the community, but what about public safety and Alan's safety? We can already see that he's falling back into old habits, and he's using controlled substances. He's hanging out with the wrong crowd, and most likely sooner or later he's going to commit a new crime and victimize maybe an innocent person in our community. So this is the big thing. Every probation officer asking him or herself in that caseload. Here's what I think we could do. We could put him on an increased supervision. That means he reports daily to me. He will get drug tested pretty much every day. We tell him, look, once a day you go to attendance of drug-related aftercare groups, a 12-step program, whatever's available there, and you try to find yourself a sponsor, which you see in point number 4. I would put curfew on him, say from 10 or from 8, 2200 is military time, or 2000 hours in military time is 8 p.m., to 7 a.m., you're going to be at home. I would put him on an anchor monitor program to review the consumption of controlled substances and his curfew, see that if he's at home. So the anchor monitor, which has contact to the skin, reads whatever is in his sweat and has a GPS, so we can see if he's actually at home. Increase field supervision, so we'll include the local police department and say, hey, look, check on my guy at least once a night. Ensure there's no one around there which he shouldn't be around with. We do unscheduled home visits and checks at the place of employment. I would, because he is already violating it, there must be some consequence. I would say go and do community work service once a week and work at the animal shelter or find something so you can give something back to the community. I would let him do daily reports. It's like a diary. Let him explain to me and to him later, look, that's how I feel, this is what I'm doing to stay clean and sober. I would have weekly meetings with the employer and treatment providers, all bring them all together and say, look, we have a guy who's struggling, Alan, we need to help him. Of course, the probation violation will go to court, so I have to write a report, send to court, and he has to answer to the judge, and most likely his conditions will be adjusted. I would put into place a treatment contract and tell him, look, if you fail one more time, I will take you to jail. We'll sign right here, and I hold you accountable for that. We have no-go areas. Let's say the wrong crowd, as Alan said, I know it's downtown every day at midnight. So there will be a no-go area for him. I don't want him to be exposed to that. And for hanging around with the wrong crowd, I would bring him back to jail as shock incarceration, arrest him, take him to jail, and within 72 hours he could see the judge in court, and then I would ask the judge to release him back on probation with the adjusted conditions. As you can see, there's a lot you can do, but does it really work? It really works only if the person wants to follow through with that. If he doesn't show up for the daily supervision meetings, he will fail. If he violates his curfew, he will be with the wrong crowd. So it's really that the methods used and tools we have fall back if the person really wants to be successful. The other question is, as I said earlier, we have a bigger caseload, 37 to 75. Here in Alabama, 150 to 200. Can a PO really work with one person let's say you have 150 persons and 20-25% of them fail, and you want to meet with every single one every day, your day would be done. There's nothing else you could do. So you see, sometimes the PO just doesn't have time to work with a person who's failing, unfortunately. Okay, one last thing, and it's just something you want to think about. Your book talks about rehabilitation, and rehabilitation means nothing else than if somebody fails, you can return to prison and you interrupt rehabilitation. I call a prison a gladiator school, because if someone is not a criminal when he goes to prison, he learns how to be a criminal while he is in prison. So if I turn someone to prison, I interrupt everything I do in the community to help him to change, to rehabilitate. But if I take someone to prison, it can also mean I save him from self-destruction, or I save the community and increase public safety, because he will, if he fails, not only self-destruct, but also victimize the community. Rehabilitation means nothing else to bring someone back to normal or to restore something. But here's the question I have for you guys. What if normal means for someone nothing else in a criminal life? What does it mean if somebody grew up in a violent home, exposure to drugs and alcohol from an early age, maybe experienced any kind of form of abuse, and you actually bring him back into that and restore this normal for him? You will never change this person. You just bring him right back where he came from. So instead of rehabilitation, I would ask you to just consider to say, we try to effect positive change. We change old behavior to acceptable social behavior. We don't want this person to return to his normal lifestyle, or restore him to that normal lifestyle. We don't want that. So the goal of society, we can see this on page 436 on figure 13.6. You see how the population of inmates increased over the years. What we try to do in probation and parole, to summarize it, we try to reduce the return to jail. We try to reduce new victimization. And we do this by supporting positive change. We try to incarcerate subjects who are a danger to society or who are a danger to themselves. And we provide help for subjects who are a danger to themselves, not by necessarily incarcerating them, but by bringing them to mental health or substance abuse providers and help him to change without bringing him back to jail. However, and that's still the number one priority, as peace officers, we focus on public safety by trying to implement community correction tools. Okay, that was it for the first lesson. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk next time about prison culture.